now you know about me. I just want to know why you're here. Are you all gardeners? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. Okay, you're what? Wannabes. Okay. There was a recent poll taken by a house that does demographic studies. And at the top of the list of how Americans spend their spare time, gardening topped the list. Interestingly enough, nature study was second. Looking at nature, you know, admiring nature, being in nature was the second. And how Americans chose to spend their free time when they weren't at work. And that's not to say everybody loves gardening. Some people on the list garden because they had to. You know, you have land around your property, on, you know, your house, and you have to take care of it. So, but topping the list, people garden. You know, so that says something about where we all are. A lot of us interact with the land. So this topic is kind of timely, and I'm glad you're here tonight. I recognize one of you from the Master Gardener program at the Phipps Garden Center. So like I was telling him tonight, if any of this is a rerun, I have to apologize. I think what I'll do is I'll get right into the PowerPoint presentation because I'm used to having about 2 hours for a class. So I'll try to squeeze everything I can into 1 hour, okay? Because I don't want to leave anything out. Let's see, make sure I go. Let's just take a look at some of the reasons why we should think about gardening in an ecologically sensitive fashion. One of the first reasons I put up there was gardeners do impact the landscape. As I said about that study, a lot of people do garden. It's okay for me whether you have it on or off. Oh, not for you. I could do hand puppets if you prefer. I'm probably more comfortable with that. Gardeners do impact the landscape from the sheer numbers. When you add together all the private landowners in the United States, we actually own more property than all the corporations, than all the farms, than all the national parks put together. It's all, when you add up all the private landowners in the country. So we do make an impact as to how we interact with the land when you look at the sheer numbers of all of us. And if you garden ecologically, you can save resources. I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but it's something like when you run your garden hose for an hour, you run approximately 150 to somewhere between 150 to 250 gallons of water through that garden hose. You can sort of do your own inquiry at home if you'd like to figure that one out. You can measure it in a bucket and see how much. It depends on how fast you run it, how vigorously your water runs through your hose. But that's a lot of water for just an hour of running your garden hose. And I don't know if you're familiar with this grass cutting thing. You know, so many of us just have to do that as part of the lawn care and having a yard. But you could probably run your car, I don't know what you drive, but most Americans could probably run their car for about 360 miles for the same environmental impact of running your lawnmower for an hour. Because our lawnmowers don't have the catalytic converters. They don't have the energy-saving devices. So when you look at the environmental impact of running a lawnmower, it's a good bit higher than running the average Honda Civic or a car like that, even sometimes a lot larger car than that. So gardening, even in just the most pedestrian fashion, does make an impact. And gardening ecologically can save resources. Gardening ecologically, as we're going to see some slides tonight, can also really support wildlife. Nancy had mentioned I'm with the Wildlife Habitat Council, and one of the things we do is to show landowners how they can garden and install landscapes on large scales and very small scales that can support wildlife, birds, pollinators, bats, all sorts of wildlife, even elk and various types of mammals, bats. You can really support the web of life by gardening, especially with native plant species. So we can show some examples of that tonight. And I think probably the most important reason to think about gardening ecologically, using native plant species and gardening in a way that sort of celebrates the place we live, is we can cultivate a sense of place. We can install gardens that attract the wildlife, the birds that live around us. We can begin to feel like we're more a part of the nature that sustains us. and sort of not at odds with it. And you know, that may sound sort of trivial at first, but when you think of all the impacts that are done to this planet in the name of sort of just having blinders on, of not seeing ourselves as part of the web of life, not part of the earth that sustains us, there's a lot of ills done to the planet. If we start seeing ourselves as part of that web of life, I think we can make a very positive impact. So by gardening in a more sensitive manner, I think we can sort of cultivate sort of a respect and reverence for the ecosystems that sustain us. And I don't know if you're familiar with the name of our state, the meaning of it, Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. We're going to talk a little bit about that today and how maybe you can install a garden that kind of celebrates that sense of place, Penn's Woods. Oops, my slide. You'll have to forgive my slide. Something seems to have eaten it. It was a very pretty violet, but sometimes I feel like roadkill on the information highway. But what's important is the little numbers up there. One of the things that I'll come back to again and again tonight when I talk about gardening ecologically is gardening with native plant species. I can't make that point clear enough, how important it is when you're making your choices about what plants to put into the landscape to consider thoughtfully those choices and to very carefully consider using native plants when you make those plants choices. I have the reputation, as you've learned last week, occasionally having been called the native plants Nazi, the garden Gestapo, because people seem to think that you know, I sort of push a little bit too hard for that. But again, my reasoning is the idea of supporting wildlife. That's not to say that I'm telling you you have to garden with native plants. We'll find out some reasons why it's a good thing to do. It's not my place to tell you what to do. That's your decision as to what you do with your land. But there are some reasons why you want to be careful about bringing exotics into the landscape. If you look at the current flora of Penn's Woods, this is sort of the breakdown. We have about 2,000 native species, and about 600 of those are species of special concern. That means they're on various threatened and endangered species lists. For some reason, scientists are worried that they may not be with us very much longer. I'm just talking in round numbers right now. And of all those 2,000 species out in the woodlands, not in the botanical gardens, but out in the woodlands, there are approximately 1,000 more that are not native. So what does all that mean? What's the big deal if there are some non-native species hanging around with the native species? The biggest concern we have is there are some non-native species that can very easily displace our native species. Some of them can take over. And here's where I get myself into trouble. Occasionally, I can go out on a limb and I can pick the ones that I really hate and I can sort of put them up there. Sometimes people say, you know, oh, there's a sterile cultivar of this plant. It really isn't all bad, but these are the ones that I'm very suspicious of, and I'll just tell you what they are. Again, it's my opinion and my opinion alone. These are some of the ones we want to watch for. I hope you can see around me. I don't quite know where to stand, so that I'm not in your way. Are you okay? Okay. The picture is of purple loosestrife, the creeping purple mantle of death, if you've ever been in wetlands throughout the Northeast. About as little as 15 years ago, if you got the White Flower Farm catalog, you saw this wonderful plant that was touted as it blooms forever, all summer long, grows in wet and dry soil, grows in sun or shade, reproduces freely. You know, every garden needs to have 5 of them. And you know, the red flag should have gone up that maybe this is a bit of a monster plant, but we really didn't know then. You know, we wanted one to have, and we thought, well, the butterflies will love it. It produces nectar. And the butterflies do go to this plant. The trouble is, this is a super, hyper-aggressive plant. This is what I would constitute as, call a garden thug. It escaped the bounds of the garden years ago when it was brought over to this country. And pretty much single-handedly has choked the life out of about 2/3 of the wetlands in North America. What used to be thriving ecosystems, diverse ecosystems that were incredibly important in supporting a wide variety of various flora and fauna, are now just seas of purple loosestrife. And so we've lost a good chunk of our biodiversity due to one plant. There's a few others on here, Japanese knotweed, which you'll see along the streams all throughout western Pennsylvania. It looks a bit like bamboo, gets a big white flower on it. Again, you'll see bees going to it. It also seems to grow very quickly. You can almost see it grow. It grows so fast. If you drive by every day, it seems to grow very quickly. Garlic mustard, the honeysuckles, except for our native honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens, but all the shrub honeysuckles, the Japanese honeysuckle, those can be very invasive. Norway maple trees, multiflora rose, autumn olive can be a big problem, and so can Japanese barberry. So those are plants that we might want to look out of and not encourage their use in the landscape. Now, do you go home and throw those out of your landscape? Does it really make a difference if you do? Probably not ecologically at this point. You know, it's more of an ethical thing more than anything, but we can certainly learn from these plants. I certainly won't put them into clients' gardens. I certainly wouldn't plant them. I certainly wouldn't want to propagate them. You had a question? Yes, that's the rose bush that you see in the old garden fields now. If you go into the woods and you see the arching canes of the rose bush, gets about 12 feet tall, gets the big rose hips on it. Yeah, sort of a whitish flower, gets a big rose hip on it. They planted it for a lot of years just to save the soil. And, you know, 40 years ago, after the Dust Bowls and everything, it was the best technology we had to keep the soil from eroding. So, you know, you can't fault the people then for putting it in, but what we know now is, you know, if we make plant choices for soil, you know, keeping the soil in place, we should go with the native plant community, not with exotic plants, because some of those can be bad choices. So, I guess the question is, does this mean, I always joke, do you have to go home and banish your Russian sage? You know, do you have to go home and assassinate your daylilies? You know, there's a whole lot of exotic plants that you could probably have in your garden that are not major threats to the environment. We have to make sound choices. Some of them are things that we really have to be careful of. Others are maybe not a serious ecological threat. What we have to do is make careful choices. I think we have to learn to recognize the traits of very aggressive plants as they come into the nursery trade and as we put them into our landscape. And you have to make those choices in your own landscape. Very exotic invasive plants, which again, not all exotic plants are invasive, but exotic invasive plants, yes? Okay, along a continuum, if you think of, we had talked about this in the Master Gardener class. I always think along a continuum of this being the Walmart parking lot and this being a healthy ecosystem, okay? All these points along here are how we interact with the land, and you can make a lot of choices along here. The more you get up to the ecosystem model and the ecological restoration model, the more careful choices you have to make about what plants you choose. Down here, I would put use of exotic invasive plants. I would put them down towards the Walmart parking lot. I would say that would be a very bad choice. Daylilies, I'd put a little bit down to that end. They're not purple loosestrife. They're not terrible choices. They have benefits to pollinators. Bees will come and use them. Things like the hybridized daylilies generally don't escape cultivation, but they don't have the same benefits that native plants have to the local ecosystem, and we don't know that they could never escape. So, you know, are they a big threat? No. Do the red flags go up for them? No. Are they the best choice to make? Maybe, maybe not. And depending on where you're gardening with them. If I was doing a garden in a very natural area or a restoration garden, I would never choose a daylily. If I was doing a garden in a very cultivated area, I would consider that a little bit further down. Do you see what I mean? So you sort of have to make your choices along where you're gardening, what kind of work you're doing. And I think there are good and bad choices. You know, we all have our sort of favorite plants that we're not going to maybe give up. Some of them are very bad choices. Some of them are medium choices. Some of them are okay choices. Some of them are great choices. And the great choices are always native plants. So there isn't a garden police, as much as I, you know, am teased about it. There really isn't one. So.
How about the one that the state pushed about 20 years ago, that was everywhere at one point. Now it isn't as many places. It's been eliminated.
See, again, my call on it is, could you turn off the camera? My call is frankenplant, you know? I mean, would I plant it in a garden? No. But, you know, in its defense, the creators of that made a plant, literally created in a laboratory, a plant that you could spray on solid rock, you know, that you could spray on the side of a highway. And goodness knows, it does that. It will grow on just about anything. But the trouble is, it's highly invasive. But it is, oddly enough, named the state plant of Pennsylvania. It is. Check out the website. You know, but it's highly invasive in the garden environment. So, you know, where I would put it on the continuum is much farther down. You know, but again, you know, if a hillside is falling in, maybe there's a place for it. I don't know. See, this is where I get myself into trouble. Again, the best choice along that continuum, I think, is always going to be native plant species. And that's one reason in the handouts that I gave you are my lists of native plants. And again, those are compiled by me, and you're welcome to them. I'll give you my email after this. You can email me, and we can haggle back and forth as to what you think should or shouldn't be on the list, and you can ask me questions. But you can have those lists. They're compiled in different ways to attract birds, for shade, and things like that. But those are the lists that I've compiled in working with these and gardening with them over the last few years. What's really important about gardening with natives is they're part of what Rachel Carson calls the web of life, the local web of life. She said there are intimate and essential relations between plants and the earth, between plants and other plants, between plants and animals. Nothing in nature exists alone. Everything on that list is a part of that web of life. So, you know, when you're gardening with these, whether you know it or not, they're connected to something else. And just as an example, you see this little mayapple? It's not the most showy garden plant, right? You might think of putting it in as a little ground cover, or if you have some in the back of your yard, you might think of, should I keep it in there or not? Well, there's a little green apple that hangs out on it, and you might think, oh, well, big deal. You know, it's not real showy. And from a gardening perspective, you know, what's the big deal about it? Well, this has a connection in the web of life, and what it's connected to is this little guy, the eastern box turtle. It's perfectly ergonomically designed so that he can just reach his little neck out there and eat that seed and disperse it for that plant. Even though box turtles can be omnivores, eat a lot of things early on in life, oftentimes the older ones are pretty much strictly vegetarian. And keep in mind that along with the box turtles and the butterflies and the warblers and everything else that lives in the web of life and depends on those plants, people are a part of it too, and so are we. And one of my favorite words was coined by Edward O. Wilson. It's called biophilia. It means life is drawn to life. To be happy people, to be full-grown organisms, we actually need contact with nature. So that's really a part of our psychic development and our spiritual development. And no, this isn't California. This is Hemlock's natural area, and this is what Penn's Woods looked like in the days of William Penn. This is a hemlock tree. And this is one of my tree hugger friends, okay? We figured we'd stop there, we'd have a good tree hug. You know, everybody called us that for years. We just could get it over with and take pictures. Okay. So there's been a lot of people over the years who have said, you know, how do we live with nature? Some of us, do it in a big way. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of how people live with nature. Well, not all of us can live at Fallingwater, but there's been a lot of us who try to figure out how is it that we can invite nature right up to our doorstep. How is it that we can get that biophilia? How can we have nature coax close to us? So we want to have it as a part of our landscape. And so what I've really concentrated on over the last few years is taking the idea of using native plants and native plants communities and putting them into landscape design. And one of the things I want to tell you is using native plants in landscape design is not about just not cutting your grass and letting everything get messy. It's not about just letting everything go. It can be very sophisticated, it can be very beautiful, and it is about landscape design. And the same rules that apply to any landscape design can apply to a native plants landscape. And it can be just as gorgeous and sophisticated as any landscape. And I can show you a few pictures tonight, and if we have time, I have a few extras if you'd like to stay. So we got to look at what does a good landscape have to be to keep a person satisfied and to work for your home. And this is sort of an overview as you go through the next few weeks classes and you sort of design your own landscape. I'd like you to keep these things in mind. There are three things that we need. Human beings are very complex. We want everything, and we want it all. We want the stimulation of a job, but we want the free time. We want the excitement of a new relationship, but we want, that sort of comfy long-term relationship. Or maybe that's just me. I don't know. But we're complex creatures, We sort of want a whole lot of things, and we want the same things in our landscape. So we've broken it down into three main categories. We need a landscape to be functional and aesthetically pleasing. We need it to be coherent and complex. And I know this is just words right now, but I'm going to show you some pictures that go along with this. And we have to be able to traverse it, to move through it. But yet we also want it to have a little mystery. We don't want it to be just so boring that you look at it and you see everything there is at one shot. So keep those things in mind as you look at the next three slides. Functional and aesthetically pleasing. As you plan out your ecologically sound landscape over the next few weeks, keep those in mind. It's got to function well for you, but it's got to look good. So when you get all excited about that composting lecture, have you had it yet? Okay. Remember, think thoughtfully about where you're going to put that compost heap. The backyard is good for some things, front yard is good for others. Remember those cultural zones. The front yard, is our doorstep to the public. The backyard is a more private space. We put the little tykes things and the barbecue out back. We put them always in the front yard. Same way here. We can get a little wilder in back and a little bit more formal in front as we plan our landscapes. So keep those things in mind. We want a landscape that functions well, but is also aesthetically pleasing. And one reason I put this in here, too, is to remind me to talk to you about surfaces. As you plan your landscape in the home and make those thoughtful choices along that green continuum, think about the surfaces that you use in your landscape. Hard, impervious surfaces create runoff. And it may not seem like a lot of runoff, but I actually do a lot of work with school students. And there's actually a neat formula we use to calculate runoff. You calculate how much rain comes down in a half hour or 15 minutes or an hour. And then you calculate the surface area of a parking lot. And you would be amazed at how many hundreds or thousands of gallons hit and run off a parking lot. You can calculate that for your driveway or your sidewalk or your patio. So what's the big deal about that? It just runs off and down the storm sewer. Well, what happens is it runs off your patio, it runs off everyone's patio, it runs off everyone's road, and it runs down the same sewer, into the same gully, into the same stream that was not meant to handle that kind of flow. And it ends up blowing that stream out. So it's a double-edged problem, too. It not only blows out the stream bed, but it prevents that water from doing what it's supposed to do, which is percolate down into the soil, back into the aquifer, and recharge our groundwater system. So we're doing ourselves a disservice by putting a whole lot of impermeable surfaces in. So consider when you make landscape choices, put in a surface that can help recharge the groundwater and keep some of that water from running off your property. So if you decide to put in a patio, consider putting down a sand bed with bricks or stone that will let the water percolate down through instead of necessarily laying down a concrete slab. You know, it may not seem like a lot of runoff from your property, but add it up to your neighbors, and it really does add up. Why not? As an impervious surface, they won't allow you to use it? It's not, I don't understand. It wouldn't count as. Oh. You mean that you would get a tax credit if you would have a surface that wouldn't be impervious? Is that what it is?
My understanding is that in this township, we are not permitted, unless it's grandfathered, we are not permitted to have a gravel driveway. Now, you can have an on the stone driveway, blacktop, concrete, but you cannot have a gravel driveway. And that is an ordinance, I believe.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, okay. Well, you have to, I guess, go by your township rules and regulations. If you can't do it on your driveway, though, consider, you know, play areas, consider patio areas. A lot of people, when we talk about grassy areas, try to maintain what we call the industrial lawn. That's a lawn that is having to be kept very thick, usually, you know, with a lot of chemical use, a lot of heavy cutting and fertilizer. It's kept very thick under a play area or under an entertainment area. If you have an area that you really have to keep as the industrial lawn, consider using that as a paved area. Or if it's a play area, consider using wood chips in that area. Line it off with a coping of some type of wooden coping and use wood chips in that area, you know, rather than maintain the industrial lawn that sucks in a lot of resources that you have to cut constantly. So if you can't do that with your driveway, you know, kind of look at some other areas, maybe in decking areas in your back area. I wasn't familiar with the rules and regulations with the driveways. But I also had that picture of the rock wall. Does this go backwards? And keep in mind, too, those little spaces in your rock wall can also be habitat for creatures like salamanders. I'm really into salamanders. They're great insect eaters. And if you have a rock wall built in this arts and crafts style, this is from Longwood Gardens at the entrance to Pierce's Woods, you can actually have creatures like salamanders living in the rock walls, so you can actually build habitat vertically in your yard as well. And keep your pesticide use down by having creatures in your yard that will actually eat the insects that you don't want. This is an example of coherent and complex. The idea here is we want a landscape that's exciting to our eye, that has enough going on that keeps us interested, but doesn't have so much going on that drives us crazy. This is what I describe as when we get plunkitis at the nursery, where we see one thing that we want, another thing that we want, another thing that we want, and we take it home and we plunk it into the landscape, you know, and we have sort of this hodgepodge of things. So we have to come up with some design element that pulls it all together. So we want to have something that pulls it together, but we also want it to be just exciting enough. So we have to find that balance. And the slide is just a little bit dark for you. I'm sorry, but if you can see that little path bends through the woodland garden, this is an idea of you want to have a landscape that you feel safe with, that you can traverse. If it's a woodland garden, you may not want to have the woodland come right up to your house. You might want to have a little bit of a space between your house and you. You might not want to have the prairie come right up to your house, a little bit too tall. But you also want a little bit of mystery. You don't want a landscape that's so easily seen that you stand in one spot and you see everything. So keep in mind those three elements as you plan your garden. And to create these natural landscapes, the way we do it is we mimic the patterns of nature, like that woodland garden. There was a canopy of trees, there was an understory, there was an herbaceous layer. We used a designer's hand to do it. You know, there's a very definite pattern laid in there. There was a very definite designer's aspect of it, but we still borrowed the patterns of nature to do it. And you draw the composition of, you take the plant palettes of local plant communities, like you look at what's a meadow for this area, what's a woodland for this area, and you draw from that plant community to as your inspiration. And you take into account nutrient cycling. And if you're putting in a woodland garden, do you think it would be wise to rake up all those leaves and put them at the curb? Heavens no. You know, you run them over and you put them back onto your woodland garden bed. So, you know, you think about those things as you put in your ecological garden. And here's the definition of an ecosystem. It's what I showed you, that web of life. It's all the things, abiotic factors are non-living factors like rocks and water and air. And biotic factors are living things. And they're all working together. But what we're talking about in landscape is more of an echo of that ecosystem. It's a visual representation. We distill the visual essence of a natural community into our landscape. It's kind of like a haiku, if you will, in the landscape design. And I'll show you a few of those now. Can we turn the lights down for just a minute? Because it's going to be hard to see a couple of these if we don't. This is Jennings Prairie in Butler County. Has anybody been there? Really cool place on 422. It's a relic prairie from the time when the earth was very, very dry, and the forests were beaten back, and the Great Prairie actually extended across western Pennsylvania into Maryland. And eventually the woodlands came back across Penn's Woods, but now we have just this little pocket of relic prairie that remains. And this is what that prairie community looks like. It's about 60% native grasses and 40% showy flowering plants. This is what a native prairie looks like. And this is what an installed prairie garden might look like. And actually what this is just the matrix switched around. There are 60% showy flowering plants and 40% grasses to make the client a little bit happier, so there's more things blooming in her prairie. Okay, we played with it a bit, but we actually kept the same basic plant palette. Here's a woodland edge. You've all seen this with an oak tree, very vertical, and the horizontal plane in front of it, the old field in front of it. Here's an installed woodland edge, same vertical plane with the birch in back of it, and you see how the designer actually used the azaleas and the button bush in front of it to create those same horizontal patterns. So you're borrowing the visual essence of a natural community, and you're reproducing the patterns of nature in your garden. Here's the floodplain at Raccoon Creek State Park in late April. And here's an installed floodplain garden at Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts. The plants the designers put in big drifts so that there's more of a visual impact instead of having one of these and one of those. They put them in large drifts for more of a visual impact. But it's the same plant communities. It's the same things that are growing at Raccoon. There's columbine, the orange Aquilegia canadense. There's the phlox divaricata, our woodland phlox. It's the same plant community. That's that floodplain plant community underneath the dogwoods. This is a pothole up in the Laurel Highlands at the top, a naturally occurring pothole in the rock. And here's an installed woodland garden at Innisfree in New York. An ecosystem. Some general rules for designing a typical home landscape for you to keep in mind for an ecologically designed landscape. First of all, reduce lawn. You probably don't need as much as you think you need. You need a place for the kids to play when the grandkids come over. Okay, you need a place to put the picnic table or to hang out the laundry. Okay, but you probably don't need as much as you have right now, so thoughtfully consider that. We'll look at a plan in just a few minutes. Mimic the appropriate natural community in structure and composition. If you want to create a woodland, think about how a woodland is made. One of the best ways to do that is to study our local woodlands. And you know what? Your homework will be hang out on the nature trails. How hard is that? Okay? You'll love that part. Go out there and look at it. You know, see how these things are made, and take back to your landscape some part of that you want to recreate. Distill it into your landscape. Create soft lines of vegetation. Gertrude Jekyll did not invent drifts. Mother Nature did, okay? So you want to put in nice soft lines of vegetation. Give up on those little tiny soldier rows of plants, you know? Put in nice soft drifts. Much more attractive to wildlife as well. You know, put in plants that touch each other and things that are nice in soft in composition. You'll attract more birds and butterflies and pollinators to your yard as well. Reduce lawn. You probably don't need as much as you think you do. It's not a mistake. I want to say that again. Solve your landscape problems with thought to nature and natural systems. When you have a pest problem, you know, consider integrated pest management. You'll have a course on that, I believe, coming up. You know, consider those thoughtful solutions. When you're looking at you have a wet place in your lawn, do you consider dredging it out? Do you consider fighting it? Do you consider putting in grass and forever getting your mower stuck in it? Heavens no. Consider a bog garden. There's a whole bunch of Western Pennsylvania plants that are just really happy with wet feet. I can give you a list. Email me. You know, don't fight it. Roll with it. You know, celebrate it. And just, you know, find the right plant for the right place. Did you know that's the second most important rule of gardening? The right plant in the right place. The first most important rule of gardening is put the brown end down and the green end up. Always designed to provide human contact with nature. Remember that third rule, you know, people want to go into the landscape. They want to have some contact with it. So if you put in that meadow, put a path through it. Put a bench in your woodland garden. Make sure that you have contact with nature. Don't do this for just the birds and the butterflies. Remember that biophilia thing. And reduce lawn. You know, you really don't need as much as you think you do. Just to run through some of our plant palette, you have the lists. We have wonderful native trees in Pennsylvania. If you have them, cherish them, take good care of them in the landscape. There are some wonderful small trees like this witch hazel. Here it is in leaf in late September. Here it is as it blooms just a few weeks later. You'll be the best gardener in the neighborhood having a tree that blooms in the fall. Here is our serviceberry. There's a whole host of wonderful small trees. Don't blame the tree in your landscape for getting too big. A lot of people plant the very large spruce trees and things like that in the landscape and then are forlorn when they become very large and you know, unyielding. There's a whole host of really wonderful small understory trees that are great choices for the landscape. This is a great choice especially because it gets berries on it. It's called the Juneberry tree, and it gets great blossoms too, so it's very pretty. But the berries are especially loved by songbirds the berries come on in June, and it's a great wildlife tree. Another great tree for wildlife that's small is the hawthorn. And my favorite cultivar of that is actually the Crataegus Winter King, if you want to look for that one in the landscape. There's another great small tree, the redbud, Cirsus canadense. This is sort of very quick gardening. It's sort of like drinking from a fire hose, you know, gardening slide. So I apologize for going so quick. I don't use a lot of native dogwoods anymore in plantings because of the anthracnose in the soil, but I do the Cornus florida. They're prone to the anthracnose disease, and they will eventually succumb to it. But our shrub dogwoods do not succumb to the anthracnose. So our shrub dogwoods like Cornus racemosa, Cornus stolonifera, do not succumb to the anthracnose, and they actually get berries on them that are very loved by birds as well. And again, you know, wildlife, that connection to the web of life, it's a great thing to have. Other plants that attract wildlife and are beautiful for the landscape, this is one of our many native viburnums, arrowwood viburnum, Viburnum dentatum. It gets a sort of a teal-colored berry on it. A great alternative to hedge, privet hedge, you know, the traditional privet hedge that you always have to trim every couple of weeks, you know, and keep whacked back. This turns a wonderful pinkish red color in the autumn, Viburnum dentatum. And these were actually being sold at Home Depot and Kmart last year. So they are out there on the market. This is our native holly, Ilex verticillata, or winterberry. These are persistent berries, stay on all winter, so they look pretty all year, and then they sweeten up for the birds in the spring, and the birds eat them off in the springtime. Are some of our native herbaceous plants. This is Virginia bluebells. Here's our native phlox and Phlox divaricata. We have two different varieties. This is not our native Solomon seal. People mistake it as this. This is false Solomon seal, or Smilacina racemosa. I use this a lot in landscape design because it's very widely adaptable to a lot of different soil types. And this is our native columbine. You saw it in that floodplain picture. You know, in a drift, it's very, very appealing. This is Aquilegia canadense. Excuse me. And because of its red color and long red nectar tubes, it's a favorite of the hummingbirds and one of the first flowers to come up for the hummingbirds. And it's funny, you know, like Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. If you have these plants in your landscape, the wildlife will appear. And if you have a progression of them, they will keep coming. And there is always a red tubular plant somewhere in the western Pennsylvania plant palette that's going to be blooming for the hummingbirds. First it's the columbine, then it's the Silene virginicus, then it's the cardinal flower, and then it's the Monarda didyma, and there's always a nectar source for the butterflies, or for the hummingbirds. So, you know, if you garden with these things, you'll be attracting, you know, a host of wildlife to your yard as well. A note about cultivars. Here are two of our native Monarda. This is Monarda didyma in the back, the red, and Monarda fistulosa in the front. They're both our straight species Monarda. This is a Monarda cultivar from the nursery, Monarda pink delight. What a cultivar of a native plant species is it's still a native plant, but it is a cultivated variety, thus the name cultivar, a cultivated variety of a native plant. They selected it out because it was shorter, or stayed shorter, or has a bigger bloom, or doesn't get as a powdery mildew, or has some trait that they figured gardeners would love, and they named it. The issue that some native plants people have with cultivars is to get this cultivar to come true time after time, they have to clone it. They have to tissue culture it. So it's not being pollinated by bees and reproduced naturally. They're actually cloning it. So it's a clone of a clone of a clone of a clone. Whenever you get a pink delight, it's a clone plant. So that makes some people nervous. I wouldn't use a cultivar in an ecological restoration or in a natural area. But then again, along that continuum, would I use it in a cultivated garden? If it makes it acceptable to a client to use that who wouldn't use another species, I think I would. So it's a choice we have to make, and that's a choice you can make. And the same way with what we call a native. This is a plant that isn't really native to Allegheny County. If you ask Jeff and the folks at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, this plant does not occur in Western Pennsylvania. It is not a native plant. It does occur in Ohio and eastward. It's a plant of the tall grass prairie. But is it a bad choice for the landscape? It's a butterfly magnet. It's a plant that will grow in our drought seasons once it's established in the landscape. So is it, or the black-eyed Susan, which is, these two show up on a lot of native plant lists in the area. So I'm going to tell you, they're not officially native plants. You know, are they bad choices, like you were asking? You know, I go back and forth. Would I put them in a restoration project? Would I put them in a prairie mix? No. Do I say they're a part of a natural community? No. Are they a bad choice for some home landscapes? I don't think so. I think you're way better than planting purple loosestrife and a whole lot of other plants, you know, because they have some wildlife value. You need to make those choices. Some other natives that really are terrific are our Joe Pyeweed. Look for the cultivar gateway. This is Solidago, one of our many native goldenrods, and ironweed. Some of our native milkweeds, Asclepias incarnata and Asclepias tuberosa, which are host plants to the monarch butterfly. And one caveat when gardening with native plants, all the plants I just showed you, all the plants on those lists, with the exception of this little baby, all the plants on those lists are easily available in the nursery trade. You don't have to ever dig a native plant up out of its habitat to garden with it. That's not what this is about. This is the plant that's sort of the poster child for wild collecting. A lot of gardeners love this plant and went out and collected it. But this plant, the slipper orchid, will only grow in boggy areas where it has a very specific relationship with a fungus that grows in the soil. Without that fungus in the soil, it will languish and die. And because it was over-collected and because its habitat is becoming increasingly sparse, this plant is endangered in the state of Pennsylvania. Is it endangered specifically now? On the endangered list, not just threatened, but endangered, right? Okay. So it's one I always put up there to remind you that when I advocate gardening with these species, look at the plant names, ask for them in the nursery. This is one you won't find on the list. This is one you shouldn't find in the nurseries. But all the plants on my list you can easily find. So when you look at your plan, you start with a blank slate. Reduce lawn. Did I say that? I'm sorry. Reduce lawn. Consider you need a whole lot less than you think you do. Consider planting woodlands, meadows, perhaps not a restoration woodland or meadow. It's not going to look like Penn's Woods. It's not going to look like Jennings Prairie, but consider pulling in some of those plants and distilling that into your landscape. And you may not think it might make a difference, but if you think that your yard backs up against somebody else's backyard, backs up against somebody else's backyard, absolutely amazing things can happen in the burbs. We can create corridors for wildlife that travel and make these epic journeys between more pristine and open woodlands in Pennsylvania down to the neotropics, the songbirds, the monarch butterflies. So keep that in mind as you make those choices. I'm going to run over to the flip charts and show you something very quickly. Do we have a few more minutes? Okay. Yeah, as Jeff tries not to electrocute himself there. Oops, I knew that was going to happen. I'm going to put this down for 1 second. Yeah, somebody do my Vanna here. Hey. We'll start with this one. Comfy? Yeah. Okay, I'll try not to smash it with them. What I'd like to have you do is just look at how to develop a plot plan for when you do your ecological design. Over the next few weeks, you'll be talking about how to lay this out. And I know my friend Richard Liberto is going to be here talking about the lawn and some alternatives for that. And one of the things you might be thinking of doing is redesigning your house. And it's important that you really think about doing this on paper before you just dig into it. You'll need to figure out how many plants you need and what you might want to have it look like. So think about working on a scale that's real easy to work with. You know, you can put away your slide rule. You can put away all those scary architect instruments, unless you're an architect and you know how to use them. But pick a scale that you can work with. And I like this paper at Kinko's that has these little centimeters on them, about an inch square. I don't know if you can see it back there, but there are little blue lines on here. And I work with a scale that I can work with. And each one of these squares, this is what we use in all our habitat workshops too. This isn't really scary for people. Each one of these squares represents 1 square foot in reality. And then I make some templates with this little circle representing a small size perennial that's just about 1 foot across. This represents a large grass, like an ornamental grass, like a switchgrass, something along those lines, because that will grow to about 3 feet. I want to plan for things being full grown, or what they're going to be in 5 years, because I don't want to have a garden so crowded that I'm going to have to be pulling things up in a year or two, okay? I have this one for shrubs, and I have this one for what I call mid-sized to large trees. Now, these are trees that I would be planting. This is about 8 to 10 feet across. This would be the size of a serviceberry or a witch hazel tree like we were looking at. That would be about this big around in the trunk. That's about as large as you're going to be able to plant and what it would look like in about 4 to 5 years after you would plant it. So this is just a way to begin planning out your landscape. Now, this isn't the best way to plan to put a deck on your house or an addition, okay, because it's not all that accurate. But certainly it's close enough to plan out your landscape. And oddly enough, this is just the size of my dinner plate. So you can see where these came from. Okay, but they're close enough. And what you want to do is walk off your property. And because I just wanted to make this easy on, what's your name? Lois. I'm going to make this easy on Lois, and I didn't do the entire landscape here. I just drew the corner of the house, okay? So what we have here, if you can see it, is the corner of the house with just the family room, and we have when they put the house in, all they did was put the driveway in, which was one of those township-friendly impermeable surfaces that's all up to code, and they put a concrete sidewalk up the side of the house, but then they stopped. Okay, that's not unusual for a developer. They'll put one up to the side and just left that. And here's the red is the property line. And over here we have one existing birch tree that the landscaper put in. Okay, this is the black line. And back here we have a few little woodlands. And here's my directions. This way is north, this way is south. So the sun comes up here, and so this area gets a lot of sun. And on this simple plan, I'm going to write down all the things that I know about my property. I'm going to write down that this is dry soil and gets a lot of sun. This is a part shade area. This gets deeper shade. This is moist soil. This has an ugly view. You know, maybe my neighbor's shed here. You know, neighbors always have a way of putting their old rusty shed where you can see it from your breakfast nook, but he can't. So this is maybe an ugly view here. Maybe this is a really pretty view that you'd like to keep. You know, so you're going to write down everything on your plot plan that you want to remember as you're planning your landscape, your ecological design. From there, you don't need to jump right into landscaping on a small level. You want to develop just a concept design. Very simply say, off here, I want to have a space for entertaining because this is my family room. Maybe we need a patio here. And somewhere along here, I want a privacy screen, and I want it to be pretty because I have to walk by there. So I don't need to figure out what I need or how many. I just need to write down sort of what I want to do. Here I want to screen out this ugly view, but I want to screen it out all year. I don't want it to be a deciduous tree that I have to look at his ugly shed in December, okay, when I sit in my family room. And maybe I want to borrow from these woodlands and make these woodlands a part of my birch tree and just make this one big woodland garden, because that would make my yard feel like it's bigger and part of the woodlands in back. See, I'm thinking like a designer now. I'm going to use that Japanese technique of borrowing scenery, okay? And then I'm going to borrow this pretty view, and it's going to feel like I have even more scenery, okay? So, and I'm going to say I'm going to keep some space for the kids too, because they need a little space to run around. And then you go from there to that plant palette, and you take out the list of hopefully native plants, okay? And you think about what plants will attract birds and what plants are the good choices. Look at that list of plants for shade. Look at the list of plants for wet places. Look at the list of plants for sunny areas. The right plant in the right place. An important rule of gardening. Okay, that's when you start to put those things together. And you start to say, okay, in this area that gets very little shade because it's in the shade of the house, I'm going to put my great rock collection, and I'm going to put in ferns, because that's going to be a good choice for there. It's going to be low maintenance for me. And I'm still going to have function, because I'm going to be able to get around the side of the house and get those garbage cans out every Wednesday night. But it's going to be beautiful, because that's an important aspect of landscaping, okay? And along here, I'm going to put in a tall sweep of grasses. That's what these blue are. And if you see, I put these dots in, and every one of those dots is one of these. 1, 2, 3, 4. I put them so they touch, okay? And that way I can measure out how many switchgrasses I'll need to buy, because I don't want to buy too many, and I want to look for the best price. And that way, when I go into the nursery, I don't have to have plunkitis. I don't have to, you know, buy a bunch of things I don't want. I know what I'm looking for, and I know to look for them on sale at the end of the season, okay? So I want to have big bunches of grasses and ironweed back here. I'm going to leave this blank for right now because I'll figure out what I'll put there later. But this is going to be my design anchor. Remember that idea of having something nice and coherent in back of it? That's what I'm going to do in back here. This is going to be my background for my meadow, okay? Back here, I'm going to put a white pine. That's going to screen out that problem area. And over here, by my birch tree, I'm going to put in a couple of spice bush who like to have moist feet because that's what the soil is, right plant, right place. And a serviceberry to look pretty in the spring, those white flowers against the woodlands in back. Okay, so I'm going to take and build a little woodland, and I'm going to have some drifts of bluebells in the spring with ferns, so when the bluebells are done, the ferns will come up. And I'm going to put some goat's beard, which if you've ever seen goat's beard, it looks a bit like a stilby on steroids. It gets about this big, and it's a big white fluffy plant in the summer, and that'll just pop underneath the birch tree in the shade. It'll be a very simple garden to take care of, but it'll be very satisfying. And I can sit on my deck and look at this. And instead of having a concrete slab, I'm going to go with a wooden deck. And I'm going to even put the wood in on an angle that angles my view up to this pretty view, so that when you walk out there, you're going to just naturally stand there and look at the pretty stuff, okay? So this allows you to sort of plan out what you want. And when you go to have that deck built, you can show this to someone. You don't have to build a deck. You can have show this to someone, and they can then see what's in your head. Or you could show this to, if you need to have a landscaper help you with this, you can have them help you with it. But most importantly, you can plan out what you want your landscape to do with for you. And you don't have to get it right the first time. You can play with this. You can have a whole bunch of these and move them around. You can use things. Instead of these, you can use, and these, you can use large gumdrops. Works well. You can eat them. You can use the green ones and eat the red ones. You can use rice cakes for these instead of shrubs. I advocate that because eating rice cakes is just a bad thing. And they actually work quite well for shrubs. And you can sort of get the whole family there and say, okay, well, how about a line of not rice cakes but shrubs along here, and play with it and see how you would like your landscape to be laid out. Mess about with it and see what works for you. But keeping in mind those ideas of, what makes a good ecological landscape. As you go through these classes and all this pulls together for you, what works in good landscape design works for an ecological design as well. So keep those things in mind, okay? And do we have time to just show? Okay, there's just a couple of slides. Yep. Do we have any questions in the meantime? What I have is just a few slides to just show you a few meadow gardens and woodland gardens, just to show you some different types, different sizes of meadow gardens and woodland gardens, so you can kind of see some different naturalistic landscapes as they've been installed. Okay, now most of us sort of want this out our front door, but we don't have it, right? Let's see, and this is a tad crooked, so, but I'm not going to. But even if you don't have space for a large meadow, you can take that idea of the visual essence of a meadow and put that into your landscape. This is one that was done with just relatively about 4 of the dogwood, shrub dogwoods, and a few tufts of grasses. So you get that look without having the full meadow. So you can sort of distill that essence in there. That's better. A little bit better. Thank you very much. Here's another installed meadow. Again, it's much more drifts and large drifts of plants, which you don't see in a natural meadow as much. Although if you go to Jennings, you'll see the culver's root. You'll see some drifting, but not to this extent. Designers tend to put them much closer together for visual impact. That is actually a cultivar of switchgrass called Shenandoah. And again, that's, you know, one of the things with cultivars is it'll turn a really neat color, so they'll pull it out, you know. So again, it's kind of your call. This is again a meadow garden. Now some of these are native, some of them are not. So again, you know, you're the designer, you make the call. I just wanted to show you some options. Definitely not a native plant, you know, but people say, you know, but hostas are such a workhorse in the garden. And okay, I do like hostas, I will admit it. The native plant Nazi, you know, has a soft place for hostas. You know, they can be pretty plants. But let's face it, the deer, it's a salad bar. You know, if you have deer, you just might as well give up on the hostas. You know, it's foolish. It's foolish. They're expensive plants. You know, we pay for them, we put them in, and they're gone. So, you know, not saying that all native plants will not be eaten by deer, but by and large, they're not bothered as much as a lot of the plants, definitely not as much as the hostas. So, you know, there are some good alternatives. With the deer populations as high as they are right now, I can't say that there are any plants that are really safe. But you know, sometimes non-native plants are a good option. But, you know, if you're looking for alternatives to hostas and for that ground cover in the shade, there's a few. Well, I would usually not advocate the trillium because that's another one I won't put on my list because it takes 7 years for a trillium to flower from seed, the general thinking. So it's hard for me to believe that any nursery grower is going to sell it for $4 or $5 when it takes that amount of time, you know, so I'm kind of shaky on that one. But the native ginger that's growing around it and the violets, those can be easily found. And I think violets are really an overlooked ground cover. They're, you know, they're a wonderful ground cover. If you're spending a lot of money on mulch around your shrubs, consider violets. And if you like the great spangled fritillary butterfly, those wonderful orange and black butterflies that you'll see around, that's the larval food source for the great spangled fritillary. So if we don't have violets, no fritillaries. So, you know, that web of life thing. So save money on mulch, have a nice ground cover, and help the fritillaries. Also consider, you know, the idea of using drifts of plants as ground covers. Nature abhors a vacuum. If you have bare space, something will grow there. So, you know, consider filling it and filling it with plants you want rather than plants you don't want. Here's some drifts of various kinds of native phlox. Phloxes, phloxi. I'm not quite sure how to say that. Embarrass myself here. And again, the right plant for the right place. These are some ferns and skunk cabbage that don't mind having wet feet that are used as a ground cover in this wet area at Innisfree. That was one of my favorite gardening moments. I was up there in New York, and there was a bunch of ladies, and they were saying, "Oh, isn't that plant lovely? It must be a new variety of hosta. What is it?" And I said, "Oh, it's skunk cabbage." But there in this wonderful setting in big drifts, it was absolutely gorgeous, you know. It sort of came into its own. So it was a lot of fun. Here's a little woodland garden done with naturalistic style, but not with native plants. There are some non-native plants in there. So again, you know, you slide up and down that continuum. You're the designer. You make the choices. Here is again, you know, some use of native plants with some ones that really aren't entirely native to this area, native to North America, but not, I would say, native to western Pennsylvania. The phlox are. This is actually a picture taken from the Rachel Carson homestead. If you get a chance to go over to the homestead in Springdale, Pennsylvania, this is part of the woodland garden over there. We've recently redone the landscape. So you can see some native plants in a suburban-sized landscape. And this is under the dogwood trees. This is Tiarella cordifolia, which is one of my favorite ground covers. And interplanted with that, we have our native geranium. This is actually Arnie Palmer's garden in Ligonier. And he did have a lot of grass. Okay, you know, go figure. Made his living with grass, I guess. But I was struck by, he had a lot of shade around the house, and he had some wonderful fern gardens, you know, in use around the trees. And he had these wonderful cinnamon ferns and the various types of osmunda ferns under the trees. And this is a great native ground cover that I try to show everybody. This is called Chrysogonum virginianum, or green and gold. And I like to show people this because it blooms in the spring and then it'll bloom again in the fall. And it's a really neat plant to have. It forms a nice loose ground cover. And it's a nice alternative to vinca, which can be a bit of an invasive problem on its own. And, the more people ask for these natives, the more they'll be showing up. But we need to ask for them, we just need to keep sort of pushing people. Green and gold. Green and gold, or Chrysogonum virginianum. It's on your list for shade plants. Green and gold, yeah, it's all run together, yeah. And this is a house up in Chautauqua. Again, very small space, but that idea of a fern garden. Here's a little serviceberry. They do have a few daylilies, which are exotic but naturalized in Pennsylvania, and then they have a fern garden underneath it. Here's more of those Monarda in natural drifts. Also consider, if you have space under trees and you don't want to do the perennial thing because it's a bit fussy, and you're afraid to put, a lot of area into perennials if you're afraid it's a bit too much work, consider using some of the smaller shrubs. This is one of my favorite little cultivars of a shrub called Clethra. This is Clethra alnifolia hummingbird. It's summer sweet. It gets a little tiny white blossom on it that smells very, very sweet. And it attracts all sorts of little teeny tiny little native pollinators. Honeybees aren't native to Pennsylvania, but there's a whole host of pollinators that are. And you'll actually see the hummingbirds darting around this plant like crazy. Hummingbirds can't live just on nectar alone. Cells need protein to regenerate. So what they'll do is they'll dart around here and they'll pick off those little pollinators. And that will be their meat for their diet. So, it's good to have these things in your garden. And it's a great plant because it blooms in the summertime when, when a lot of our exotic azaleas, like from Japan, bloom around Mother's Day when we're not out enjoying them. This one blooms in June, late June, when we're out in our garden and we can really enjoy it. Again, another garden from Chautauqua. There's sensitive fern in front of it, in front of some larger osmundas. And native plants can be very sophisticated. This is, again, that garden at the entry of Pierce's Woods. This is Joe Pyeweed, believe it or not. One of our roadside plants that we consider, sort of a roadside native. And here it is in a very sophisticated planting display. Pardon? This might be the gateway cultivar. That's what they say, but I don't think there's any different because I've actually grown both side by side in my garden, and I found out if you have the straight species and you pinch it, just like any plant, if you pinch it early in the year, it will get smaller and bushier, and so you get a slightly bigger head on the gateway flower, but really not much difference at all. They'll stay shorter. So, oh yeah. Yeah, they pinch everything a bit too much, don't they? And again, the idea of those impervious versus pervious surfaces, if you have a space that you're trying to keep that industrial grass on, consider wood chips, consider, some other surface that will let the groundwater recharge. This is a very pretty way to keep up a garden. And it also allows you to do things like this. This is a little recirculating fountain that just the bowl is hidden in the stones, and it's just enough so that the birds get a spray of water and it recirculates down, and it's only 3 gallons of water, and it just keeps on going. And again, not all of us have that huge space to work with. Reduce lawn whenever possible. Start with those banks that are impossible to cut. We all have them in western Pennsylvania. Start with those, begin planting on those, begin planting for wildlife, pollinators, birds, plant the things that they like, start to get those in for your garden. Do what makes you happy, but, keep in mind that the neighbors are there and keep in mind those cultural zones. and some of those basic ideas for how to plan out your landscape to be satisfying to you. And there's a whole bunch of different ways, you know, that you can interpret what a front yard and a backyard looks like. Landscaping is a whole lot about personality. This yard doesn't feature native plants, but it certainly is a neat way to look at a front yard as not that, you know, sort of creeping green mantle of death, you know, not the creeping purple mantle of death, but the creeping green mantle of death that, you know, is the sort of American icon, that lawn. But this is a wonderful welcoming garden. That's a whole bunch of herbs that will be attractive to pollinators and a host of bees and various animals. And, you know, it's a very beautiful landscape, allows the groundwater to recharge, no mowing required. It's really a pleasure to be tending a garden like this. So, you know, keep in mind there's a whole bunch of ways. And again, this is the person who came up with that idea of the web of life, but she actually was born and raised here in western Pennsylvania, and this is a picture of her house. And when she was a little girl, you know, she traversed these woods and these meadows, and what we've done at her house is tried to distill the visual essence of these woodlands and these meadows and put them into that landscape. And so we've used a lot of the native plant palette out there. So if you take a ride in Springdale, drop over and see these plants, and it changes. The show changes every 2 weeks, you know, so come over and see them in bloom, and see how you can maybe adapt that to your landscape. Come over and see that. Because, you know, these are the plants that are really a part of all of our lives, and they're a heritage of Penn's Woods and our shared heritage, our cultural heritage. And I think if we celebrated them more, we'd be probably happier people and probably a whole lot better off ecologically. Okay, and I probably went way over my time, so I better wrap up now. But thank you very much. I'll be available for questions afterwards if you have any. Thanks for coming, and good luck on this series, and thanks for undergoing this endeavor in your own yards. If I can be of any help to you, please stay in touch, okay?